The towers of Vega Prime glittered like sharpened blades, each one a monument to wealth and dominance, their mirrored faces catching the dying light of the planet's twin suns. Beneath them, the corporate sector pulsed with its usual mechanical rhythm, cargo skiffs humming through maglev corridors, loading drones flashing hazard lights as they glided between platforms, and the constant low thrum of engines vibrating against glass walkways. Inside the highest of those towers, where polished stone floors gleamed and air recyclers whispered like servants, Vera Nextari sat before a holographic display as wide as the horizon. The Vegarian CEO was the embodiment of her lineage, tall, elegant, skin glowing with an iridescent sheen that shifted from cobalt to amethyst under the light, her antennae angled with unconscious authority. She had built an empire on noticing what others overlooked, on dissecting data until patterns revealed themselves like prey in the shadows. And tonight one anomaly refused to leave her thoughts. Eric Walsh, a human. Cargo handler, level 3, assigned to Bay 12. His file should have been unremarkable. 32 standard years of age. Earthborn, no family contacts, hired 3 years prior. Yet the metrics lined up with an unsettling precision. 0 tardiness. 0 disciplinary actions. Double shifts every day without variance. Performance ratings well above sector average. Efficiency curves that charted like computer algorithms rather than flesh and bone. Vera's amber eyes narrowed as she scrolled through his history, her long blue fingers making minute gestures across the holofield. Humans were useful, hardy, occasionally clever, but predictable. They broke down under strain. They rebelled when bored. They sought advancement, distraction, vices. Walsh did none of those things. He simply worked, and kept working, and worked again, as though fatigue and ambition had been excised from his design. It was, in its way, unnatural. Her antennae twitched, a betraying flicker her board of directors had learned to fear, because it meant she had found something worth hunting. On impulse, she commanded the console, surveillance feed, Bay 12. Last cycle. The screen dissolved into flickering footage. And there he was, the human, broad-shouldered in grease-stained coveralls, lifting crates that would have strained automated lifters. His movements precise, practiced, patient. Sweat glistened across his forehead, dampening strands of light brown hair, muscles flexing with every fluid motion. It was not the strength that arrested Vera's gaze, though her secondary heart beat faster at the sight, but the posture straight-backed, uncomplaining, a quiet dignity in the way he handled each container, as though the work itself deserved respect. Most workers grumbled, stole moments for illicit breaks, or sagged under monotony. Eric Walsh labored as if the universe itself depended on the completion of this shift. "Magnify," Vera murmured. The image zoomed to his face, strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes that carried the deep, restless blue of Earth's oceans. Yet what struck her was not symmetry, but the weight they bore, exhaustion layered over a fierce determination. Like a man carrying an invisible burden, he refused to set down. For the first time in months, Vera felt her practiced detachment falter. He was hiding something. No worker chose this path of endless repetition without reason. Curiosity coiled through her veins, a serpent more dangerous than ambition, for it whispered possibilities beyond spreadsheets and market shares. She leaned closer to the display, eyes narrowing as if she could read the secrets tucked behind that human's steady gaze. "Computer," she said softly. "Flag subject Walsh Eric. Priority observation." The system confirmed with a polite chime, but Vera barely heard it. Her antennae angled forward, attuned to an instinct that had never failed her. This was more than corporate efficiency. Something deeper drove the human, and she intended to find out what. The day bled into Vega Prime's evening with the same mechanical precision as every other cycle. But Vera Nextari's anticipation made the shift feel stretched, taut like a string on the verge of snapping. From the viewing decks of her tower, the corporate sector gleamed with its immaculate symmetry streaming lines of transports. Sterile corridors that smelled of recycled air and sterilizer. Thousands of lives moving in exact corporate rhythm. Yet her gaze kept sliding back to one dot of light on her personal tracker. Eric Walsh, departing Bay 12 at precisely 1900 hours. As always, his predictability might have comforted another executive, proof of reliability. But for Vera, it was a hook in her mind, pulling tighter with each cycle. Tonight, she would not merely observe through screens. Tonight, she would follow. She shed the authority of her position as carefully as she shed her executive attire. The flowing silver gowns, the jeweled crest that marked her lineage, all replaced by a plain tunic and leggings designed to conceal the luminous sheen of her Vegarian skin. A hood shadowed her iridescent features, and a field scrambler dulled the glow that usually drew every eye. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw Vera Nextari, CEO of the most powerful conglomerate on Vega Prime. She saw another anonymous soul drifting through the arteries of the city. Perfect. From the shadows near the employee exit, she watched him emerge. Eric carried himself with a kind of weary certainty, shoulders squared under the weight of another endless shift, his coveralls patched and worn at the seams, boots scuffed from years of labor. No hesitation marked his stride. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had mapped every step of his routine long ago. But there was purpose in him, too, something harder, something burning beneath the fatigue, and Vera found herself leaning forward to catch the cadence of his gait. He boarded a public transport without pause, choosing the lower-tier shuttle rather than the comfort of an executive skimmer. That in itself was unusual. Most humans in steady corporate employ, especially those pulling double shifts, spent their credits on small luxuries. Walsh saved his, or hoarded them, or wasted them elsewhere. The shuttle rattled as it descended from the glittering spires into the city's veins, the neon glow giving way to fractured lights, clean architecture decaying into rust and grime. The blue sector. Refugees, vagrants, the unwanted all clustered here in a maze of alleys where law bent and corporations looked away. Vera's curiosity sharpened into a blade. Why would a man with steady work return here? As the shuttle jolted to its stop, she slipped out behind him, steps featherlight, her instincts making her near invisible amid the crowded, sullen throng. Walsh carried a box now, one she was certain had not been in his hands at the exit. It bulged with weight, his muscles straining subtly against it. But his expression remained set with quiet focus as he wound through the labyrinth of alleys. The smell of rust, cooking oil, and unwashed bodies clung to the air. The buildings leaned like tired giants, their walls patched with scavenged panels. Walsh navigated them without hesitation, as though he belonged. Vera kept her distance, pressed against walls, antennae tilted to read the currents of sound. Then he turned into a narrow passage, and she almost revealed herself. So sharp was the surprise that jolted her. From the shadows ahead, shapes spilled forth children, small Vegarians with thin limbs and antennae bent like withered stalks, their blue skin dulled by hunger. Their eyes lit the instant they saw him. Mr. Eric. They cried, voices rising with a joy she had not heard in years. He knelt at once, setting down the box, and the little ones crowded him in a tidal wave of need and trust. He opened the container with care, revealing not contraband or luxuries, but food packets, clean water, small bottles of medical supplements. One by one, he handed them out, no favoritism, no impatience, calling each child by name, asking after coughs, bruises, school lessons that surely did not exist here. When a frail girl coughed, antenna cracked near the tip. He smiled gently and offered her medicine. Speaking softly as though she were precious beyond measure, Vera stood frozen, a breath caught in both her hearts. This man, whom she had marked as an anomaly, whom she had suspected of deception, had been burning his life away, not for vice or secret ambition, but for them, for alien children abandoned in the rot of her city. Shame curled through her, foreign and unwelcome. Her corporation set wages. Her corporation ignored Blue Sector. Yet this solitary human worker had poured his earnings, his strength, his very hours into a cause with no profit. Compassion without calculation. She pressed herself harder against the wall as he caught a stumbling boy with hands that were calloused but infinitely gentle, her vision blurring for an instant with something she dared not name. It was then she understood. Eric Walsh was not hiding weakness. He was hiding a strength her world had long forgotten. And she, Vera Nextari, meant to uncover the depths of it, no matter the cost. For 8 nights, Vera kept her distance. The hood of her disguise pulled low as she watched Eric Walsh repeat his impossible cycle-double shifts in the loading bays. Then long hours in Blue Sector kneeling in the filth to care for children that weren't even his species. At first, she funneled her guilt into action, arranging for her assistant Pox to deliver anonymous supplies, insulation panels, reinforced walls, clean bedding. She ordered it all routed through a web of untraceable channels, so even Eric's uncanny perception could not tie the source to her. Each time she returned to observe, the shelter was improved, the children healthier, their antennae brighter, their laughter ringing sharper against the broken alleys. Each time, she felt the contradiction twist tighter inside her, an alien CEO who measured lives in credits, now standing transfixed by a human, who gave away everything he had without hesitation. But on the 9th night, as the children showed off new toys and clean blankets, Eric's expression changed. Confusion shadowed his ocean-colored eyes, hardening into suspicion. He scanned the street corners with the focus of a predator scenting danger. "These things don't just appear," he muttered to the older boy at his side. "Somebody's watching us." The words struck her antennae like a lash. She realized then that secrecy had only deepened his mistrust. The answer came 2 cycles later, not in Blue Sector, but in the very heart of her empire. Alarms chimed in her private quarters long after midnight unauthorized presence detected in the corporate archives. Her command codes flicked through the system in a blur. The cameras revealed him. Eric Walsh, the perfect worker, moving like a shadow through the blue-lit vault of her records hall, bypassing biometric locks with unsettling skill, his hands quick on the glowing keys, as though corporate systems were old acquaintances. Vera dismissed the guards with a single command and strode down herself, silk robe trailing, antennae fully extended in alertness. The archive doors parted at her approach, spilling white light across polished floors. Eric froze mid-keystroke, but didn't flinch, didn't beg. He turned slowly, jaw set, blue eyes narrowing as they fixed on her. "Ms. Nextari," he said, voice steady though his breath came hard from the chase. "I suppose there's no point denying what I'm doing." She circled him like a hawk might circle a grounded animal, studying the tension in his shoulders, the way he tracked her every step. "Breaking into corporate archives carries a minimum 5-year sentence on Vega Prime," she replied coolly, her tone all executive precision. "Care to explain yourself?" His reply was not the groveling of a caught thief, but the blunt honesty of a man with nothing left to lose. "Someone's been interfering with my kids. Deliveries, upgrades, too precise to be random. I needed to know who and why." The words pierced her. "Your kids?" she asked, voice softer, despite herself. "They're Vagarian orphans." His gaze did not falter. "Species doesn't matter. They're mine now." It was not a claim of ownership, but of responsibility, spoken with such iron that Vera felt her second heart stumble in its rhythm. She stepped closer, drawn into the warmth radiating from his human body, the defiance in his stance. "And you suspected corporate involvement," she murmured. "The supplies weren't random," he countered. "Too targeted. Someone knew exactly what we needed. Someone watching." His suspicion sharpened into challenge. "Was it you?" For a long moment she let silence hang between them, the air vibrating with electric tension. Then she stopped directly before him, close enough to breathe the earthy scent of sweat and steel that clung to him. "Yes," she said at last, letting the word fall like a stone into still water. "It was me." Surprise flared across his face, followed by wariness, then something more complex she couldn't yet name. "Why?" he demanded. Why would the CEO of Nextari Holdings care about gutter kids in Blue Sector? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to tremble with more than corporate strategy. Perhaps for the same reason a human cargo handler spends his wages feeding them. "Because you intrigued me, Eric Walsh." His breath quickened just slightly, and the look in his eyes was not fear, but the dangerous patience of a man on the edge of belief. In that moment, Vera understood she had crossed a boundary no protocol could define. Curiosity had led her here, but something else, something more volatile, would keep her from turning back. The sun rose over Vega Prime, in hard amber light that painted the towers of the corporate sector in deceptive brilliance. But beneath that shine, Vera Nextari felt the fracture lines spreading. The board had summoned her to an emergency session, their tones clipped, their antennae bristling with carefully masked hostility. They whispered about irregular expenditures, about questionable personal entanglements. Vera knew the real reason they had noticed her. Diversions of private funds into Blue Sector, and the way her attention strayed, from profit sheets to welfare reports. She entered the polished boardroom with the grace of her lineage, silk uniform shimmering, but her thoughts were split. One eye on the chamber's displays, and the other on the tiny feed projected inside her wristband. Across the city, Eric Walsh had taken matters into his own hands. He had pieced together patterns from the anonymous shipments and the children's stories, tracing them to a nondescript warehouse that pulsed with more security than any ordinary storage depot. Now, hidden among crates, his device streamed back fragments of what he saw. Frightened children herded into containers, guards with military-grade rifles bearing no corporate insignia. Proof that the whispers in the shadows had substance. The board's voices droned around her, Director Krell leading the assault with smug precision. His skin, darker than most Vigarians, gleamed as he declared her conduct a distraction from fiduciary duty. He projected selective financial records, fund transfers routed through shell companies that he framed as her indulgences. Vera's jaw tightened, antennae curling with the effort to appear calm. All the while, Eric's feed flickered in her peripheral vision, narrow alleys. His breath heavy as he whispered updates, the edge of his voice carrying the discipline of someone who had been a soldier in another life. She wanted to respond, to warn him, but to break her mask here would be to hand Krell the victory. And the feed spiked brighter, and she knew Eric had made his move. The boardroom's main display shuddered, and to the director's outrage, seized control. Suddenly, the sterile financial graphs were replaced by jagged footage, children with antennae drooping from hunger, packed into containers branded with the discreet sigil of a Nextari subsidiary. Gasps rippled across the chamber, denials spilling from the accused, but the evidence spoke louder than their words. Krell's face twisted into fury, antennae rigid. "This is manipulation," he snapped, "fabricated by our enemies to discredit us." But the footage kept rolling. Eric's harsh whispers layering over the images as he counted guards, cataloged weapons, called out the cries of terrified orphans. Vera seized the moment. rising with a calmness that silenced even the loyalists. This is not fabrication. This is what has been hidden under our name, under our authority. This is what your obsession with profit has allowed to fester. Some directors shifted uncomfortably. Others sneered, but the balance of power was shifting. She pressed harder, her voice a blade. While you polish towers, our children are being sold. While you measure credits, humans and Vegarians alike bleed to keep this corporation afloat. Her words were dangerous open rebellion within her own council, but she could no longer cage the truth after what she had seen Dot at that same moment. The feed trembled violently, Eric's breath quickening. They're moving the kids now. His voice cut through, raw with urgency. At least 20, maybe more. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The image of small blue faces pressed against metal bars, searing itself into every director's mind. Vera's hearts pounded, twin drums in her chest. Her world was dividing before her eyes, the empire she had inherited on one side, and the human with ocean-colored eyes, risking everything for strangers on the other. She made her choice with the clarity of steel. Standing tall, she declared, if this corporation cannot protect the innocent, then it does not deserve to exist in its current form. I will not allow Nextari Holdings to be the mask of monsters. In the chaos that followed directors shouting, Krell's threats spitting like acid, guards moving to cut the feed, Vera's thoughts were not on the room, but on Eric, alone in a warehouse crawling with armed syndicate men, clutching his device like a lifeline, his determination radiating through every flicker of the transmission. The board might have thought this was about politics, reputation, control. They were wrong. It had already become something far greater, a collision of compassion and corruption. And the first blow had just been struck. The first explosion ripped through the silence of Vera's private residence, just as dusk cloaked Vega Prime in its copper haze, shaking the crystalline walls and rattling the rows of suspended light fixtures. Her security system screamed alerts across every surface, a cascade of red glyphs warning of perimeter breaches on 3 sides. Syndicate forces had come, not in whispers or threats, but with steel and fire, intent on wiping out the evidence she and Eric had torn from their hands. Vera moved swiftly, antennae rigid with focus. As she activated defensive protocol shields rising, internal corridor sealing, the children she had smuggled from Blue Sector ushered into the reinforced core chamber deep beneath the tower. But her mind kept circling back to the man crouched beside her at the control station, blood seeping through the patchwork bandage on his shoulder, face set in grim lines that spoke of endurance more than fear. Eric Walsh, the human she had once thought suspicious for working too hard, now sat at her side, preparing to hold the line against an army. The syndicate strike teams advanced with precision, their black armor reflecting the flares of pulse fire as they breached the lower levels. Vera's residence had been built as a fortress, but even fortress walls could crack beneath sustained assault. Eric worked with the instinct of a soldier long out of uniform, coordinating firing arcs, repositioning automated turrets, using her alien technology with unnerving adaptability. When a squad forced its way into the West Atrium, he was already there, pulse rifle in hand, barking orders to her security detail like a commander whose authority came not from title but from conviction. She caught herself watching him, even as the firefight thundered, noting the way his body shielded the path to the children's chamber, how his eyes never wavered from his goal. Compassion without calculation, he had no profit to gain here. No reason beyond his own unshakable sense of right dot between mirages. Their words carried the rhythm of people bound by urgency and something more intimate. This isn't how I pictured our third date, Eric said dryly, snapping a fresh power cell into his weapon. Despite the roar of battle, Vera's antennae curled in amusement. Humans consider this courtship? She asked, voice sharp but tinged with warmth. The adrenaline, the danger, the chance to impress, yes. Definitely a date, he replied, firing another controlled burst that sent a syndicate trooper sprawling. Their banter was reckless in its timing, but it steadied the rhythm of their defense. Weaving trust where before there had only been curiosity. When the enemy shifted tactics, flooding the lower levels with grenades that disabled the automated guns, Eric made the call without hesitation. Flood the ducts with coolant. Freeze them in place. Vera hesitated. Only a moment venting cryogenic gas meant sacrificing most of the house's systems. But the thought of the children huddled in the core chamber hardened her resolve. Initiating purge, she said, hands flying across the control panel. A hiss like 1,000 serpents echoed through the tower as sub-zero vapor billowed, icing over steel and syndicate armor alike. Through the surveillance feeds, they watched the invaders slow, stumble, and finally fall silent, statues entombed in frost. The reprieve was brief, but it bought them time. Eric slumped back against the wall, breath steaming in the cold, sweat mixing with blood at his collar. Vera knelt beside him, her blue fingers brushing against his shoulder, wound with surprising gentleness. "You need medical attention," she said, her voice low but urgent. He caught her hand, firm but not rough, eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I need you," he said simply. In that moment, surrounded by ice and ruin, her carefully built walls cracked. For the first time in her life, Vera understood that survival was not measured in credits or power, but in bonds forged when everything else was burning. Outside, sirens howled as Galactic Council reinforcements approached. But inside the battered walls of her residence, Vera Nextari realized that her fight and her future would no longer be fought alone. 3 months later, the skyline of Vega Prime seemed softer, as if the city itself exhaled after decades of suffocating under syndicate shadows. From the observation deck of Nextari Tower, Vera stood tall, her iridescent skin catching the last light of the suns. Her antennae lowered in a rare gesture of peace. Below her, the streets no longer whispered of fear. They sang with rebuilding. Across 3 sectors, the Orion Syndicate lay in ruins, its leaders dragged before the Galactic Council, its child trafficking operations exposed to every channel. Inside her tower, a new wing thrummed with life, the New Beginnings Foundation, the first official haven for orphans of every species, funded by a corporate tithe that had once gone to shareholders. But Vera's gaze was not on the city or the future it promised. It shifted to the man who stepped silently onto the deck behind her, his presence as steady as gravity. Eric Walsh had shed the grease-stained coveralls of Bay 12, though the calluses on his hands remained, a reminder of who he was and what he had endured. His posture carried the same quiet strength she had first seen in the loading bays, now tempered with a mantle of recognition director of human Vegarian relations. Though he wore the title like he wore everything, without vanity, only as another responsibility to shoulder. He joined her at the viewport, leaning against the railing with casual ease, his ocean-colored eyes fixed on the horizon. "The verdict came through," he said, his voice deep with satisfaction. 37 syndicate officials convicted. 12 corrupt council members stripped of power. The networks are gone, Vera. The children are safe. His smile softened, transforming the scars at the corner of his lip into a badge rather than a wound. She turned to face him fully, studying the man who had begun as a curiosity in her files and become the axis of her life. "Your idea to redirect corporate profits into rehabilitation programs, half the board thought it madness," she said, her antennae curling with faint amusement. Now they quote it as visionary policy. Eric's laugh was quiet, humble. Amazing what survival and evidence will do. She reached out, tracing the faint scar on his shoulder, healed but never forgotten, and whispered, "Have I mentioned today how remarkable you humans are?" He caught her hand against his chest, the steady beat of his single heart pulsing beneath her fingers. "Twice," he teased, his eyes bright. "But I wouldn't mind a third." The silence that followed was not emptiness, but fullness, a shared rhythm that needed no words. Then Eric drew a small box from his pocket, hesitating only long enough to catch her gaze. "This is probably terrible timing by Vegarian standards," he said, voice edged with nervous humor. "But humans tend to follow their hearts, not their schedules." He opened the box to reveal a simple band of iridescent alloy, shimmering like her skin under the suns. On Earth, this symbolizes a permanent partnership. Complicated across species, sure, rare, but after everything we've faced, I want this. With you. Her heart's clenched, antennae curling forward in a gesture of joy so profound it surprised even her. She silenced his doubts with a kiss, not calculated, not transactional, but fierce and certain. "Yes," she breathed when they parted, her voice steady as a vow. 1,000 times yes. Together they stood, watching Vega Prime's lights ignite one by one, not as symbols of profit, but as beacons of possibility. In the guest wing below, 34 rescued children slept in safety for the first time in their lives, their futures no longer bound in chains, but in hope. Vera Nextari, once the cold architect of an empire, and Eric Walsh, once a grieving father burning himself out in double shifts, had remade each other. They had turned loss into defiance, suspicion into trust, and compassion into revolution. And as the stars rose above Vega Prime, their joined silhouettes on the deck promised a truth that no boardroom, no syndicate, no council could erase, that the smallest act of humanity could ignite a fire bright enough to change the galaxy. The council banners still fluttered above the skyline when the storm came, back for them. Not with weapons this time, but with whispers and politics. Vera Nextari found herself standing once more at the head of her boardroom table, though everything about it felt altered. The polished surface no longer gleamed with unchallenged authority. It was now scarred by memory, by the knowledge of how easily power had been twisted beneath her father's watch. Around the table sat new faces directors who had passed rigorous scrutiny, vetted by both the council and her own investigation teams. Yet even here, shadows lingered. Reports arrived daily of splinter syndicate cells regrouping, of old allies shifting uneasily at Nextari Holdings' sudden crusade for ethics over profit. And into those shadows, the name Eric Walsh carried weight, both as symbol and threat. He sat at her right, not as a subordinate, but as a partner. His plain attire a contrast to the ceremonial robes of Vagarian leadership. Some bristled at his presence, antennae twitching with disdain, but none dared voice objection. Eric had become impossible to dismiss, the human worker who had uncovered crimes spanning sectors, who had fought beside their CEO, who had turned orphans into a cause the galaxy could no longer ignore. Yet Vera knew what he concealed beneath his steady gaze, the ache of memory that still dragged at him like an anchor. More than once she had found him at night, staring out at the stars, as if searching for the wife and child who would never return. His grief was a wound that had not healed, only been redirected. And it was that wound which would shape what came next. The meeting devolved into arguments about margins and allocations, voices rising over her insistence that 15% of profit streams remain dedicated to the New Beginnings Foundation. As Krell's old loyalists pushed back, Vera felt frustration coiling until Eric spoke. His voice was low, unpolished, yet it cut through the chamber like a blade. He told them about the blue sector alleys, about children clutching at his hands with hunger in their eyes. He spoke of finding medicine with his last credits, of a girl with a cracked antenna who smiled for the first time because her cough had eased. He spoke not as an executive, but as a father who had once failed to save his own. And in that naked honesty, the board fell silent. Even the hardest antennae bent under the weight of his truth. When he finished, Vera reached for his hand openly, letting the gesture settle like a signature across the moment. "That," she told the room, "is why we will not turn back." No one challenged her again, not later that night. Away from the towers and their sterile brilliance, Vera and Eric returned to Blue Sector, not as hunter and anomaly, but as builders. The shelter he had carved out of scraps was now a center thrumming with laughter, its walls humming with new heat panels, its floors covered with clean mats. Dozens of children, Vigarian, human, and more ran to greet them, their cries weaving into a chorus that carried across the ruined streets. Eric crouched, catching Thule as she leapt into his arms, her antennae vibrant with health. Vera stood beside him, watching the way the children gathered as though he were a hearth fire they could never extinguish. Something broke open in her then, something she had kept hidden even from herself. It was not just compassion that bound her to this human. It was love. But even as warmth filled her, a shadow lingered at the edge of her awareness. Data streams she had intercepted suggested the Orion Syndicate was not dead, only wounded. Cells remained, embedded in other corporations, feeding on the same corruption that had once infected her own. And worse, the name of a counselor one who had voted for conviction in the trials appeared in hidden ledgers. The revelation chilled her, but she said nothing yet. She only slipped her hand into Eric's as the children laughed around them. She would tell him soon. Together, they had brought down a network that spanned 3 sectors. Together, they could face what was coming as the twin moons of Vega Prime rose, casting silver light across the alleys. Vera felt the future settle into her bones, uncertain, dangerous, but no longer lonely. She had once followed a human worker out of suspicion. Now she followed him out of trust. And in that trust, in the clasp of his calloused hand against her iridescent skin, she glimpsed the possibility of a galaxy remade, not through profit or power, but through a stubborn, reckless, unstoppable compassion. The children's laughter echoed like a promise. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together.